Welcome to Cyber Leaders Podcast with me, Ciaran Martin.
And me, James Line. Now, we're both from the SANS Institute who are kindly backing this podcast. I myself am a massive geek, and I've spent my career chasing cybercriminals around the internet.
Now, I'm not a techie. I led on cybersecurity policy and operations for the British government and set up the National Cyber Security Centre. But now, James and I are trying to unpack for you the weird and wacky world of tech security and all the complicated challenges it brings.
That's right.
Now, last time, Frank Kim gave us a masterclass in how to talk to the board. This time, we're going to apply that. We're going to talk again to an actual Chief Information Security Officer, someone charged with the defense of one of the most complicated organizations anywhere in the world.
Ciaran, sounds to me like you have someone in mind.
I absolutely do. One of my favorite CISOs, a real industry leader, someone with a fascinating job on the back of a series of other brilliant jobs. So she's got a whole range of really interesting experiences.
I always know I'm in for an exciting ride when you say fascinating twice in a paragraph. So sounds good. Who is it, Ciaran?
I'm just being verbose, but she's not. She's forensic, brilliant. She's worked in cybersecurity for a big IT company, a major bank, a major real estate company. She's worked in life sciences. She's even worked in Costa Coffee for a bit. And now what about this? She is the Chief Information Security Officer for the British Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome to Helen Rabe.
Good afternoon.
Amazing. Hello, Helen. How are you?
I'm very well, gentlemen. Good afternoon to you both. Thank you. That's a serious introduction, and the bar has clearly just been set as rather high.
Well, hopefully you've had your good dose of coffee. And given your background, you'll know where to find the highest doses for sure. But let's get started, Helen. So first up, tell us how you ended up in cybersecurity. What was your journey like?
The journey has been slow. So I started in IT in the 90s, mid-90s, which tells you my age without committing to it. But it was networks and project management. So I started off as a basic BA when I started out, and then project management in IT and networks. And security was always one of the deliveries within the portfolio, right? Basic firewalls, network security, it was always there. And I always had a fascination with it, but the entry barriers were tough. In the 90s, you could forget it. In the mid-noughties and early noughties, still very difficult. If you didn't have the technical certifications and qualifications, getting into it was just not going to happen. And I found that really challenging because although I was proficient on the technology landscape, I didn't have the certifications. And that's not where I wanted to spend my time. So what I then did was I did a project for a bank off the back of a compromise. The bank will remain nameless. And that was really getting my toes dipped in the water, seeing what I could do, what I could achieve, and the competency to show that I didn't need the technical certifications. I could do this. I had the understanding. I was able to go forward with this. Still, I couldn't get moved out of where I was. So I resigned and I started to become what I would call a fixer. And back then in the late noughties, early tweens, nobody wanted to know. If you'd been compromised, you kept that hush-hush. It wasn't publicly disclosed. There were no regulations and mandating as such. And honestly, back then, if you were compromised, it was frowned upon and you were seen as a failure and really lacking.
Oh, I remember those days well, Helen. Oh, they hurt, didn't they?
Yeah. So I became this fixer in the background and in the shadows, working with third-party companies to go in, remediate the projects and programs that they required. And of course, they didn't require somebody to make friends with them. That was one of the key attributes, go in, fix this, don't make friends. Oh, that's fine, I can do that. And that was really where I started to get my hands dirty, so to speak, but also showed that there was a call for the service delivery, project delivery, etc., within the security space. And it didn't just have to be about the tech. And then, as life would have it, fortuitously, I got a call out of the blue. One of the third parties I had worked with on those previous remediations had recommended me to Costa Coffee for an analysis and investigation that was ongoing with themselves. I went in, did that work for them, and then I handed them the conclusion report. And they very graciously said to me, yeah, we'd like you to do this for us. And this, but you need a head of InfoSec. You don't need a fixer. Well, we like what you've done, and we'd really like you to just continue doing this for us. And that was my first senior leadership role. So it was my big break.
Amazing.
The learning curve since then has been steep, to say the least, and it never will stop being steep. This is not an industry that has a static moment in time. You get everything and then you're done and dusted. It just never stops. So yeah, that was the background. That's how I got to where I am.
So true. You're always learning in every of the different security disciplines. I really hope that the breach in question was called the Great Cappuccino Breach of 20X.
No breach, no breach. It was more a case of what is happening and how can we fix this if there is something that needs to be remediated.
An analysis.
Yeah.
The Great Cappuccino Check-in, then we shall call it.
You really are stuck on the cappuccinos, aren't you? Is this your drink?
I love a cappuccino. I really do. It's true. But I think at this point in InfoSec, after 20 years, I might have replaced my blood with caffeine. It is interesting hearing your journey there, Helen. I remember the kind of earlier days of this industry and how ill-defined the roles were. And all of it was about being as nerdy as possible, which was great for me. But even as a nerdy practitioner, there was very little role definition or clarity of how you get into the stuff or how you develop yourself role by role. And it really does sound like you managed to land on the pioneering edge of business communication and bridging technical to business that I think has become more of the default for the security leadership role now, and for good reasons.
It has, but it wasn't taken as such in 2014, 2013. As a matter of fact, I was scoffed at for my approach. There was ridicule. I tended to always focus on the human-centric aspect, that technology was not a panacea. And if we focused on this, it would be at our expense. We had to be far more encompassing than that. But, it's taken time. We're there. We're certainly much better than we used to be.
But Helen, you've conjured up really interestingly this history of a profession that's changed quite a lot. Almost sort of Wild West days of talented people struggling to break in, of people concealing breaches and incidents all the time. There must have been some crazy days back then. Give us a war story of a crazy day in cybersecurity back in the early days of your career.
Oh, God, if you're going to go for back in the early days, I have less crazy stories then than I do now. But I will say this. When I first started out in earnest doing this, I was in financial services, heavily regulated, right? So they had structures, they had frameworks, they had the rigor in place for security. And they were driven because of business practice and regulation. But then when I moved from that environment into retail in 2014, completely different. Non-regulated environments were, in my opinion, and this is subjective, the Wild West. I even did a presentation where I leveraged the EDS advert with all those Marlboro cowboys herding cats, literally, because that's what it felt like. When you walked in from a financially regulated environment with that rigor into an environment that did not have the need for regulatory overhead, where did you start? Everybody was like, is it really that important? Do we need it? What really drove the push towards immature companies from a security standpoint, immature security postures becoming what they are now, was GDPR. Back then, GDPR was the drive for companies to start going, you know what? We've never done this. They've never had to. It was piecemeal. And justifying the expense, justifying the need was very, very difficult. GDPR was leveraged for a lot of that justification to bring those security postures up, to start building up maturity, to start looking at how your teams were managed against a governance framework, where the compliance sat, all of that. But that wasn't until recently, 2014, I'd say. And it's when GDPR started to come in that push in these non-regulated environments really started to help us get that conversation into an area that was literally like herding cats.
So yes, some things have changed. GDPR clearly changed things. Far fewer people are concealing data breaches anymore. The risk just isn't worth it. Or fewer people are concealing. There's still plenty of it going on, but you have to manage your obligations.
Those with bad advice are concealing it, Ciaran.
Yes, those with bad advice. Not listeners to this august podcast and our expert guest. This issue of certificates and accreditation versus other ways into the industry, that issue's still with us, isn't it, Helen? So I wanted to ask you about another sort of new issue, which is basically about the position of a CISO. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, we were barely talking about the name CISO. I think it was only 30 years ago that somebody awarded himself the job title of CISO for the first time.
Yeah, that was at Citi.
Yes, that was at Citi.
1998, I think, was Citi.
Yeah, something like that. So now moving from the sort of history of it to the present, it strikes me, particularly in somewhere like the BBC, the range of your responsibilities, to call it information security doesn't quite capture what you're responsible for or what you're asked to do, does it?
Not at the BBC. Look, here's the challenge with the CISO role. It's undefined. It means different things to different organizations. Each organization is unique in its risk appetite, its risk posture, its business operating model, what matters to it. What matters at a life sciences company is intellectual property and the value of that intellectual property. That's the focus. What matters at the BBC is availability, and now becoming more and more prevalent, the data. So each CISO role needs to model itself against those requirements of what the business is looking for, what's driving the business. The CISO role itself recently has really come in for some focus, and that's been driven by a narrative over in the US more than anything. And I think our European counterparts in Germany might be following suit, but this was driven out of the consequences of the Uber and the SolarWinds fallout. It's this notion of personal liability or legal culpability for us as individuals. And where does this leave us? We're not a profession. But there is a strong drive and a strong conversation over the pond at the moment to get this formalized. I'm speaking with a brilliant group of women on Friday night around what this means for us. Now, here in the UK, we tend to be about 3 years behind the curve. I think sometimes we treat the US as a debugging sort of protocol. You iron out the creases and we'll just figure it out ourselves.
I like that. We're putting that one on a t-shirt as well, Ciaran. It can have a map and everything.
So they tend to lead the charge, and this is going to get me in so much trouble, but we tend to refine it, make it more user-friendly and neat. But we're not being driven like they are by the SEC and Congress and things like that. So they have a very, very targeted focus on this because of what it means to individuals. And what does that mean as a profession? We're going to go forward. Can we get our profession formalized? Like engineers, accountants, lawyers, doctors, can we do this? Because if you're going to hold us to account for things at 9 times out of 10, and you look at risk profiles and you look at the risk acceptance, does not fall within my purview to be accountable for. So it's a real challenge for us in the CISO community at the moment. We're not a profession. How do we get ourselves recognized? Can we do this? And what does this mean for us going forward as a role, A, from a reporting line, but also B, from, if you think about package negotiations. If you're going to move me into a really sensitive company and there are regulations that say I'll be personally liable, the package will need to reflect that, whether it's the legal fees that get taken into account. If you're going to fire me for this, well, if I'm dependent on others to deliver the security portfolio, how do these things work? I see this now as a CISO role. When we talk about the CISO role, I see this directional trend taking place as how are we going to formalize this as a profession?
Yeah, I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how that definition plays out, given, as you say, some of the variations in different, shapes and sizes of organizations. I've got 2 little follow-ups for you based on what you're saying. It's really interesting. I'll give them to you both, because then you can think about the second one whilst you answer the first one. So firstly, across a lot of different CISO roles, there's a lot of different responsibilities, reporting lines and so on, which we'll talk to more shortly. At its core, what do you think are the couple of most important things a CISO does in an organization? There may be variations, but what are the things in common that we all ought to pay attention to as security leaders and have our eyes on? And then the follow-on to that, you touched on it. Look, the kind of chilly winds from across the Atlantic with personal legal liability, from the Uber case. Good, bad, ugly, uncomfortable, but necessary. How do you think about those in our drive for professionalization and the role that we as security leaders play?
You might have to help me on the second one again. But on the first one, what in common? All right, as security leaders, you get told, what's your job? To secure my business, to secure my organization, its people, its assets. There's that rota, this is what we have to do. Everything I tell you now is subjective, right? This is based on who I am and how I am as a CISO. So from a security leader standpoint, one of the things that I say we have to be more and more in tune with is our board. And this is a challenge because in some companies, a lot of CISOs do not have board face time. I'm very privileged. I have a CTO who considers this a necessity and he has confidence in me and puts me forward. And as he calls it, it's me keeping him honest as well. He's not threatened by that dynamic. He sees it as a value to him. We need to be able to stand up with confidence in front of our boards. You mentioned earlier about being concise, that relevant statement. Be clear about what matters to the business, how you're looking at securing that, but also being honest about some of the acceptable risk decisions that are being made. I find acceptable risk these days and the decisions being made around acceptable risk in businesses, it's like we have fatigue because we're moving into this cloud-based ecosystem, partnership ecosystems, third-party supply chain is just becoming a bigger and bigger concern. And there is this almost implicit trust in the relationships when you purchase these services without understanding how that shared responsibility model works. So there needs to be a clearer communication with the board around this direction. Your business is moving in this direction. You continue to accept risks associated with this digital frontier that you're taking and this approach to cloud-based services where you're trusting your third parties. It's not that simple. And we need to be better at having those open conversations and not just waiting for the board meetings, but that allyship in advance where you have coaching sessions with board members and you need to have that inroad so that you can educate them and help and guide them because they're the ones ultimately, and you see the pressures not just on CISOs, it is on the boards as well. It's on the board members They have to have more accountability for what's happening in the cyber world, in the cybersecurity space. So, offer them that opportunity to have a better allyship with you as the CISO. I would say so. That's one of the stronger principles. I'll go into others if we need to, but that's the focus for me. Let's go back to the other one. One of my thoughts on the chili wins conversation.
Yeah, almost listening to your previous answer, do we need to be paying CISOs danger money because they might be going to jail?
Well, look, again, subjective. You're going to have to compensate them proportionally for what you expect them to carry. If there is an expectation that CISOs are going to be the head that rolls when a security breach takes place, and obviously it has nuance, right? If you are willfully found to have been negligent and you have been deceptive, the consequences be damned. On your head, the evidence will speak for itself, and you have to take those consequences. But there needs to be some proportional measure of protection for the CISO. I will insist, for example, on legal fees being paid if it gets to that stance. Danger money? Well, if you're going to fire me, but ultimately the breach was caused because the business decided to accept a risk that we told them was clearly not in their best interests, then proportionally there needs to be that measure of compensation, I would think. And many of us are thinking in those terms.
I think that's a fascinating change. And look, for lots of people listening, they may not be thinking about this yet, but we may be moving towards a domain of risk management and culpability that isn't unlike a position other types of executives hold. So there are at least parallels here or precedents to follow. But Helen, following on a little from this, one of the things we get asked about SANS all the time, particularly when we're doing risk and governance type stuff, is what sort of voice should the CISO have in an organization? Now, you've touched on this a little bit already. You drew out a couple of really good ideas that are on a highlight once you had a chance to kind of answer the question. But it's not just about who they should report to, though that can be important. It's about what you need around you to succeed and how to have balances everywhere given that. So, for example, the BBC doesn't exist to do cybersecurity. So you can't do things that would stop it from doing what it's set up to do. You stop the business from operating, but you're really secure. No one's going to be celebrating. What does a good relationship between the CISO and top management look like? And I know you've touched on this a little bit, but if I could add this extra dimension, did you just kind of arrive and fall into it and go, I have a fantastic relationship? Or did you have to build it? And if you did, as I suspect,
yes,
tell us a little bit about how you did that, because I find a lot of CISOs struggle with this.
Again, this goes back to the type of company and the culture that you have and what matters to the business. How do I do it? Okay. I operate like a PR campaign manager and a diplomat and a marketing director. I am all things to many people.
The ultimate generalist, Helen.
When it comes to comms, I think I could be a superb comms manager. I don't do social media. I'm not a fan.
Very wise.
Yeah, there's a term in social media I've always loathed. And I mean, no offense to anybody who does this as a profession, but it does make me cringe. Is that of an influencer? But that's what you need to be here. You need to be an advocate and an influencer for security and for the business. Don't speak in terms of just security. You have to be speaking in terms of the business. So top down, bottom up. If you're going to get people to adopt what you need them to do by way of security practices and behaviors, you need to appeal to the bottom and the top and meet in the middle. At the top, what did we do? We meet with the PAs and the EAs. They become very strong allies. Why? Because in some companies, they do the CEO's training for them. That doesn't happen at the BBC, I can assure you that. But it's a case in my past incarnations, that has been the case. All right? We meet with the PAs and the EAs. This is just an example. You train them. They, by extension, coach their C-suite and the like. They are your allies. The next is you have a program of work that has some quick wins that shows the credibility of security and why security can be of value and not a blocker. So choose your quick wins selectively. They normally need to be done at the top level. Those quick wins are about visibility and gaining trust. Then when it comes to middle and lower management tiers, do things that meet the cultural needs. Now, in the BBC, this is a challenge because it's a massive organization. There's no singular culture. So when people say to me, how do you do security culture or change security culture? You have to look at your audience respectively within the dynamics of the organization. Where do I need to gamify? Fine, let's do it that way. Let's do escape rooms because it appeals to a certain generation, a certain mindset.
I like an escape room.
Yeah. So for me, it's about that influencing. You have to influence across all the levels of your organization, your business, and you have to be visible. I am privileged to have what I believe to be one of the most phenomenal security teams in the business at the BBC. I do a lot of networking. When I arrived, I didn't know any of them. I've not met any of them in the various circuits and the conferences and what have you. I called them my back of house ninjas. And that's because they'd been in the shadows, right? You can't influence if you're in the shadows. So security shouldn't see itself as a shadow organization that is a bunch of ninjas that you only see us when you need to. No, you've got to have visibility. You've got to be there. Be transparent. Bring people to the conversation. Figure out what matters to them. One of the things that we've recently discovered was really popular in gaining traction was identifying people in the business who had been subjected to fraud, whether it was dating scams. We brought them to the table so they could tell their stories. And then we did small podcasts with them and small interviews, which we then pushed across the BBC as this is a real life experience. So the topic is online fraud, online scams. Here are BBC colleagues who've been through this. They're willing to share their stories and it makes it real. So that's all about the influencing. You know, when I go back to 2007, when I got my first smartphone and I sat with this thing and I thought, this is awesome. And I looked at Facebook and I thought, well, okay, that's not going to end well for anyone.
That could go on a t-shirt too.
I stand by that. But I just thought back then, but this means that security becomes part of our lifestyle. It becomes part of our everyday existence. How could it not? And it was then that I made the clear decision, security was going to be my career profession. It was going to be my career of choice. Because if that was the case, that meant security was going to become a part of our everyday lives and it would keep me gainfully employed to the end of my days. But it also means that security is then relatable and people can no longer hide behind that. It only matters at work. Because it no longer matters just at work, it matters personally. And those are the hooks as well that we use. So I feel I'm not taking a succinct way to answer your thing about what type of voice does a CISO need. Depending on your organization, you are the face of security. You are the advocate. You're everything. You have to be all things to all people, front and center.
Yeah, and what I like in there though, Helen, whilst you may reprimand yourself for a lack of brevity, I actually thought that was fascinating because, your answer was, yes, of course, I need to be a good communicator and a politician. I need to be visible. I need to be present. I need to be a teacher. I need to be articulate. But you also spent a lot of time talking about how you very purposely identified other people to build relationships with and then featured them.
Yeah.
So telling other people's stories and using other voices. And I think that's a good thing to draw out for security leaders who are listening. Having people share their experiences, share their stories that aren't from the security team, getting to other executives and spending time coaching them or their assistant, as you shared, mapping out actively and working other voices is a really good tactic there, I think.
Well, the challenge is, otherwise it becomes like a parent-child relationship.
It does.
I'm not a parent, not biologically. But when you do the security dynamics with training, we tend to find people become desensitized and we become white noise. And that's a risk. So what we've done is proactively engaged people across the business with their own voices. It's not our message. We're there to help push it forward, but it's not just us. It can't just be us.
Yeah, I like that.
So let me ask you about this team of yours, because you've given us an absolute tour de force of the relationship with top management, the wider BBC workforce, and the really clever use of their experiences of online fraud and cyber and all the rest of it. But then we come back to your team. Maybe it's another parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking back to what you said right at the start of this podcast. You talked about your own experience trying to break in, about not catching a break, and then it taking you a while to break through. And obviously, you've never looked back, but you're now the CISO of one of the most famous and important organizations in the UK. You've got a global footprint. So when it comes to building the team, let's talk about skills. Everybody whinges about skills. It drives me mad. Oh, there's not enough skilled people and so forth. And every 30 seconds, somebody issues a new report saying there's like 15 billion shortage of workers by 2098, etc.
It's actually 21 billion now, Ciaran. You've got to stay up with the week's news.
Well, exactly. It's gone up. So 2 questions. 1, how do you find building the team in terms of capacity and skills? And secondly, thinking back to what you said earlier about how you initially struggled yourself to catch a break in the industry and this whole issue about qualifications and certificates versus other ways in, where do you stand on that now that you're a hirer and team builder of a cybersecurity team?
Okay, let's start with the second. I'll go back to the first. The qualifications, etc., having learned from bitter experience and personal experience means that I am cautious with this. I have known people who have out-certified me 10 times over and couldn't do the job. I've known that as an employer. I've employed people who have got the CISM, the CRISC, the CISP, everything, but pragmatically speaking, struggled to do the job. So they have the book smarts, they can do that, but it takes more than that. So I don't hold store in that alone. It's one aspect. It shows that you've got the principles, and that's great. You've studied the principles, you've grasped them. But I've seen people with so much enthusiasm trying to break in, and that gives me a virtue. It's tenacity, it's perseverance, it's creativity, because, some of them, the way they've gotten through to me has been really creative, and I respect that out-the-box thinking. So each person on their own merits. But I have people with, my technologist has a degree in music.
Wow.
Right? It's the individual. He's brilliant. I call him my shell. So I'm the soft squidgy inside and he's the shell. He's the bit that protects me because I'll go and build castles in the sky. And he'll turn around and go, oh yeah, no, we're not doing that, Helen. It's great cloud skin thinking, but yeah, no.
Helen, to that point though, super quick thing and then continue.
Yeah.
It is interesting. So I'm thinking about some of the most amazing people I've had work for me or worked with over my career. And of course, look, you got to have the skills. You got to be able to do the stuff at the keyboard. Otherwise it's not helpful necessarily, although there are plenty of soft skill roles too. But some of the most amazing folks I worked with in malware reversing labs, profusely technical roles, came from backgrounds like one was a chef, but had a weekend hobby of reverse engineering kernel malware.
Yeah.
Someone else from a kind of bio background invented some phenomenally creative approaches to technical problems, drawing on these other disciplines. So of course the technical skills matter, but I think what you're saying, and if you are, I want to validate it, it aligns to my religion. Interesting people who are interesting and interested, combined with, skills, builds teams that are better at problem solving and richer than just people who can tick the boxes of theoretically being able to achieve the task.
Well, you're certainly more eloquent than I am, but yes, that is the principle in question.
I've had more caffeine, that's all it is.
We need the diversity of thought, right? And a lot of times we find also, speaking of that, a lot of the individuals in question are neurodiverse. I have a very high proportion of neurodiverse team members, but they're brilliant. They require a different type of leadership and a different type of management, but I don't care because they add value to who we are and how we operate. So, Ciaran, when people say skill shortage, well, I tell you what, if you continue to be binary with your entry level requirements, you are going to be doing yourself a serious disservice, in my opinion, because there are people out there who are phenomenal. They'll need a bit of coaching, a little bit of leadership, but when they bloom, they're just awesome. They're phenomenal assets to the team.
I got to share this tiny anecdote to support that, by the way. So one of the things we do, we have a lot of mission academies, bringing people from different backgrounds into cybersecurity, awarding scholarships to help people get their start. And I will tell you, I have seen some terrifyingly capable talent come from people with next to no background. And you give them the right training, the right kind of business mentorship, because of course it's more than, as we've said, just the kind of sitting down at the keyboard. You can produce incredible talent quickly. If you break the pattern of, I would like to hire a junior SOC analyst with 5 years experience, please, and 17 certifications.
Correct.
Because that doesn't work. It's just fishing from the same pool. Sorry, Ciaran, I could see you were itching there.
Well, my line on that is when people whinge about skills, and they do it all the time, I'll say, look, you've got two choices. Choice number one, give up. Or choice number two, do your bit to grow the talent pool. The number of times where I thought, if I took this advice about skills seriously, particularly when I was in government, I would just give up. So kudos to what you've done, James, and you, Helen, for reaching out beyond the whole 5 years experience with qualification X or Y. Now, we'd love to talk to you all day, Helen, but sadly we can't because there's so much more we could get into. But I have to ask you, you've been at the BBC, for a couple of years now and counting.
2.5 now.
It's not exactly been a quiet period. You're a global organisation, one of the most high profile in the world. And geopolitically, it's been a bit sort of troubled.
Yeah.
You were caught up, as were hundreds of other organisations, in the Klopp ransomware data breach. And there was that moment in July this year when the whole of the UK is watching you live at 10 p.m. to find out who the government's going to be. So what's it been like operationally for you with all this pressure on the team? And is there one thing you found really difficult and one thing, that maybe went really well, something that you're really proud of?
Operationally, okay, no 2 days are the same. And you never know what's happening, right? It's just...
No pressure.
It's a really reactive environment, but it is a brilliant place to work. And the team carries me in this regard. What have we done well? All of this credit goes to my teams and wider teams at the BBC. We didn't know when the election was going to be called, but we sat down in November last year and we said, right, what's our worst case scenario? Okay, we have to be ready for worst case. Yes, let's call it July, summer. They're going to go in summer.
Frankly, you sound readier than many of the participants in the election.
I've got to be honest, I was a little bit smug. There was some smugness. But, we started prepping in November. The teams were talking to third parties, internally, government organizations, building our risk profile, looking at threat assessments, working on threat intelligence. When they called it, we had a little bit of a loose end to pick up, and that focused on disinformation. But that was really the only loose end we had to take. We were ready to go. And that is a credit to the teams in the BBC, not just the security teams. I mean, they're phenomenal, but the wider technology and media operations teams as well, supporting us with that. The one thing I will say that we do really, really brilliantly in the BBC is collaborate when it comes to things. And the big ticket items, the collaboration is brilliant.
And you need to do that in something like disinformation because it's not really classic cybersecurity. I mean, countering lies and impersonation and so forth, it's a different skill set, isn't it? It's a different set of capabilities.
Yeah, it is. But much like with GDPR, I'm seeing another trend here, right? So GDPR didn't have a home. when it started. People didn't have data privacy officers and data privacy teams, et cetera, et cetera. But Article 32 became the foundation on which everybody based their GDPR programs. I swear to God, I never want to see that thing again. But because it mentions security, everybody got told, Helen, you need to do Costa's GDPR program or this GDPR program. And it's like, but it doesn't belong to security. It had no home. But eventually, when it matured, we don't own it. We're in partnership with our DPO teams. Disinformation is a very similar thing for me. There is no natural home, but I know that people talk in terms, there's the parlance, right? The disinformation SOCs, threat intelligence, things like that. Language that naturally sits in our area, and therefore people are pushing that towards us. And my biggest concern and challenge with disinformation is the lack of understanding around it. It's still immature, but people think we have a lot more control and effectiveness than we actually do. And that is just creating this whole, it's going to sit with security, you're going to own it. I'm not quite sure what you're expecting us to do for you, but yeah. So that knowledge and that maturity is going to have to grow as well. And I feel like we've digressed. There was another question around...
Oh yes, what did you find really difficult? That was the hard question we've avoided.
Tell you what I did find really, for the first time in my career, that I hadn't experienced with all the brilliance that goes on at the BBC. The BBC's commitment to due impartiality is not a platitude. The editorial teams exemplify it, right? I don't care what anybody's personal opinion is on this. I've seen it firsthand. But when you are in the midst of doing an incident like the clock problem and Move It, and your editorial team reports on you, that's an eye-opener for me. That was a very strange phone call when I got it.
Yes.
It was like, right, so this is so-and-so from editorial. One of our journalists has reached out to Klopp. And I'm like, well, this is new.
Please send your answers to the difficult questions to your own press office. Yeah.
So it was fine. Okay. I was told, and I understood this as part of the role, that the due impartiality, that's what this is about. So therefore, I'm in the back, I'll do what I can. And my teams and I were moving ahead. But it was also very interesting because although I trusted I trusted the process implicitly. I understood what was going on. I had my concerns about what it would mean for the journalist, but he was prepared for that. What I was not prepared for was my peers sending me memes with own goals.
Savage.
And things like that.
Savage.
It was brutal. So that was a very different dynamic for me to have to experience as a CISO. I'd never had that before. And I'm fine with it. But it was a shock to the system when it happened. That, I would certainly say, was one of the most challenging things I've dealt with as a CISO myself, was that my peer community coming at me and going, what are you doing? Like, what's this about? And internally, everybody going, this is the job. And you go, okay, I signed up for this. Understood.
That is absolutely fascinating. I don't think many CISOs have experienced something like that. I want to ask you one more quick question, and then I know we're running short of time here, but I do think this trend of disinformation, the introduction of escalating AI capabilities, the World Economic Forum not that long ago described it as one of the most prevalent risks for the planet, period.
It's number one on their top 10 list.
Yeah, which I thought, at first I kind of rolled my eyes at compared to the other things on there, and then thought about and kind of went, oh, yeah, this is that scale of societal issue. But for you as a CISO for the next few years, what is it you kind of are most worried about? That wake up at 3 a.m. on the pillow that comes into your mind? Is it disinformation? Is it AI? Is it something new and progressive? Is it good old security basics? Like, what's the thing you've really got your eye on for the next few years?
Okay, there are like 10 questions in there, and all of them are hot topics that I could spend hours on with you if you want to do the existential. But
yeah, that's my style. I know.
What keeps me awake? Nothing keeps me awake at night. I can't. Honestly, I can't. I can't let it. I don't have control over any of this. But if there was something that I would say that is a bugbear or a frustration, it's this notion of these things being new. And Ciaran and I have covered this before, right, on disinformation, but specifically also AI. This is not a new threat. But the problem is that this threat is now, we've got that whole velocity and amplification thing going for it, and people are losing perspective.
Yes.
So I just find the reactiveness of it. 1 minute somebody's saying something and then it gets in the media and it becomes hyperbolic, and then the board catches wind of it or senior leadership catches wind of it, and it just suddenly grows out of proportion. It's that proportional response to things. And this is the other thing as a CISO, right? We're at the ultimate swans on water. The building could be burning and we'd still be sitting there looking unflappable. If you're a CISO with the salt, you do not flap. And it's just this proportionality and this hyperbolic response to things these days. This is not new. It's same vector, more amplification for us on AI, and people I'm sure will strongly disagree with me. So what keeps me awake is being able to calm people down and bring them back down to a rational and reasonable conversation with informed responses and decisions that are not reactive. That's what really, if something frustrates me and would keep me up at night, it's the fact that I've had to run down a rabbit hole that's really wasting time and energy for myself and my teams to placate something that actually is not this hyperbolic. It's that hyper response that seems to exist these days that causes us a lot of tension and a lot of lost energy and time.
That is fascinating. And Helen, I used to teach a lot of incident response, not to CISOs, but kind of IR leaders. And one of the things we talked about being crucial was being zen in the storm, the calm island in the eye of it. And the importance of kind of constant calm professionalism to the process, because everyone else panics when these things hit.
Yeah.
And I think your wording there is a wonderful reminder to security leaders. We have to epitomize that too. We have to be the calm in the storm, because it erodes our credibility to join the hype cycle of everything else ultimately when we're trying to have these mature and well-structured and risk-oriented conversations with security leaders. And I also just want to underline I don't let myself lose sleep over this stuff.
I try not to.
It's not easy, I know, but it's so important because it is easy to obsess over an individual technical risk or a problem. I've sat in the middle of a breach and I've been awake at 4 a.m. wondering what I missed. And is it about to explode again? Is that attacker still in there? Do I need to go check something? And you end up in this cycle of chasing your tail rather than making thoughtful decisions based on risk.
Yeah.
Because you never get the closure that you might hope for. I just really thought that was a fascinating set of commentary, and all of us as security leaders should take it to heart. But look, we're short of time here, but at the end of every episode...
And you can blame James for this because it's his idea.
James?
It'll only be one question though, don't worry, not 10.
Okay.
Look, I think it's only fair if we ask people that are listening to us, they get something that's useful at the end that they can take away and apply to their jobs.
Wow, what's the last 20 minutes been about?
Exactly. Now with brevity.
Well, we want you to condense it so they can fast forward it to the end. Oh, that's such a Helen answer. It's the best Helen answer ever. Right. So, Helen, we're asking you to give us your 30-second takeaway, the key bit of advice to somebody about how to defend a cyber organization from all these risks. Off you go.
Okay. It goes back to what I just said. You're not alone. Lean in. I mean, I don't want to be the Sheryl Sandberg thingy, but lean in. This is a community of people. If it's one thing we've become much better at, it's collaboration in the last few years amongst us as a CISO community. Leverage through your peers. You are not alone. Do not think you can do everything because you can't. You will crash and burn. So it's not a weakness. It's really not. Your teams, lean into them. They won't see you as weak. That vulnerability, if anything, will be respected. And your peers, they have huge amounts of knowledge and support and understand what you're going through. There's a lot of empathy there. So don't do this alone.
Wonderful. And actually, you didn't repeat the last 20 or 30 minutes, so it was something new.
I think it was less than 30 seconds too. God, the BBC's good at this stuff, aren't they?
Well, indeed. And quoting the former CEO of Facebook on cybersecurity in a really actually magical and compelling way. Brilliant. Thank you, Helen.
If I can't do something that exasperates Ciaran in a conversation, then I haven't done my job.
That was wonderful. Really love the bits of advice you've given to CISOs who sometimes, don't have the time to stand back and reflect on it in the way they maybe should in the midst of all these fires. So I'm glad you reminded people to do that.
You're welcome. It's been fun. Thank you both. I appreciate the invite.
Absolutely brilliant. Not entirely sure I'd want your job, but there you are. And I think next time we're going to talk to one of the most interesting observers of our profession.
Oh.
Someone you know quite well, James, I think.
Yes, indeed. I've actually known for more than 10 years from the early days of the dark web and producer of several books and studies. I think he's going to be a really insightful guest. But for today, I think that's it.
Apart from feedback.
Yes, I always forget the feedback thing. That's hugely important. Tell us what you want to hear, how we can help you make your organizations more secure.
Go to the podcast site or email us at cyberleaderspodcast@sans.org.
So for today, thanks for listening.
Keep cybering.
So from me, James Line.
And me, Ciaran Martin.
Toodle pip.